Good morning. Today we are reading from The Princess Hynchatti and Some Other Surprises by Tanith. The first story in the book, which is The Princess Hynchatti. And here's a picture. The Princess Hynchatti lived with her father, the king, in a huge castle. He was very nearsighted, but wouldn't admit it. On one side of the castle it was always sunny and warm, and there were beautiful gardens. On the other it was stormy, and it usually rained. When it wasn't raining, it was snowing, or hailing, or there was a gale. Nobody lived on that side of the castle except some spiders who always had bad colds. When the princess was old enough, her father decided he would like her to learn magic. Already, her governess had tried to teach her music and sewing and simple algebra, but Hynchatti was not really very much good at these. She couldn't dance without treading on her partner's toes, or add up more than 2 numbers at once. Her sewing was just horrible. "Hynchatti, my dear," her father began, addressing a rose bush, "would you care to learn magic?" "Yes, father," said Hynchatti, who was several yards away. "Dear me," said the king, "I really shall have to have these spectacles changed. I was talking to that bush just now instead of to you, my dear," he added to a pear tree. To teach the princess magic, the king hired a fat, happy witch called Girdle, who whizzed in through the castle window on a broomstick. The broomstick was long and brown, and was named Clob. "Hello, hello," cried Girdle, landing. "Here we are at last. My, you've got some nasty weather on the other side of that castle. It's snowing and raining and hailing, and there's an earthquake a few feet from your back door." "One gets used to it, you know," said the king. "And this is the princess?" asked Girdle merrily, hugging Hynchatti. "How do you do?" gasped Hynchatti. "Quite well, you know," said the witch. "This is Clob, my broomstick." "How do you do?" Hynchatti repeated quietly. The broomstick uncurled an arm, and they shook hands. As soon as tea was over, Girdle took Hynchatti into the schoolroom. It had been rearranged. There were dried skins and strings of beads and large, dusty books everywhere. Clob was propped in the corner, smoking his pipe. "There's no time like the present, I always say," chuckled Girdle, throwing some snake fat into a black cauldron that was bubbling on the hearth. "Let's try a few simple spells. Repeat after me. Ernal, Pernal, Dippily-Dock, I should like to be a clock, Humple-Dumple, Filigree-Sfory, make it snappy or you'll be sorry." And hey, presto, Girdle vanished, and there was a fat clock with a round face cheerfully ticking. Hynchatti was delighted. "I'll try," she said, but somehow she couldn't quite remember the spell. What she said was this: "Ernie, Perny, Dimmily-Dick, I should like to be a click. Oh dear, that's not quite right. Himble, Pimble, Funnily-Filly, make it snappy or you'll look silly." There was a terrible bang. The broomstick fell on the floor, and the cauldron shot up the chimney. When the smoke cleared, there stood Girdle, quite astonished, and on the floor was a very small Hynchatti, ticking away loudly. "Boomf!" yelled Girdle, and there was another bang, and Hynchatti reappeared suddenly at her proper size. "Never mind," said Girdle. "Perhaps you'll do better tomorrow." "Well, my dear," said the king as he kissed her good night, "how are you getting on?" "It's a little difficult," said Hynchatti, "but I expect I shall improve with practice." The next morning, when the princess came into the schoolroom, she found Girdle packing her bags. "I'm so sorry, Hynchatti," said Girdle, pushing in a toad, "but my sister has been taken ill, and I shall have to go away for a few days to look after her." She closed the bag with a snap and got onto the broomstick. "Goodbye for now," she said, giving Hynchatti a quick kiss. "I have left a book open for you to read while I am away. You may practice the spells if you like, but do be careful to read them out exactly as they are written." And the next minute Clob had her whirled through the window and up into the sky. Hynchatti sat down and began to read the book. She was not very good at reading either. But she did her best. She decided she would like to change the cauldron into a cat. Nickery, pokum, pussery, paw, she began, getting the spell all wrong as usual. Hurtle, turtle, more and more, nitch'em, scritch'em, bite'em and snap, change the cauldron into a cat. There was an awful bang, just as before, and the next minute the cauldron, still looking exactly like a cauldron, leapt off the fire and jumped onto her lap, purring loudly. "Oh!" screamed hynchatti. "Oh! Boomf!" she yelled, remembering that this is what Girdle had done. But it only made things worse. All the dried skins and strings of beads fell off the wall and began dancing around and around in the middle of the floor. "Oh dear," said hynchatti, near to tears, and she started to turn the pages of the book, searching for help. The magic had become very strong, and at each page she turned, winged tigers and chocolate mice shot into the air. "Urgle, gurgle, aniseed bun," shrieked hynchatti. "Hopple, popple, spots on the sun," howled hynchatti. "Rimble, cymbal, bellow and stamp, drop the lizard into the lamp. Oh dear, that's not right." And she burst into tears. There was a roaring sound, a clattering, and then the biggest bang yet. The dried skins and beads climbed back up onto the wall, the tigers and chocolate mice vanished, and the cauldron jumped back onto the fire. "Thank goodness," said hynchatti. But her voice seemed very small. She looked around her and stared up at the table, several miles above her head. "I feel funny, too," she complained. "I feel long and hairy." And just then a mouse ran out of a hole. "Excuse me," said hynchatti. "Do you have a mirror I might look in?" "Wait a minute," said the mouse, and ran in again. When it came back out, it carried a big looking-glass, which it propped against its tummy. hynchatti looked in and screamed. "Oh!" screamed hynchatti. "I've turned into a furry snake with whiskers." And she had. "Well," said the mouse, "I can't stand here all day holding mirrors for you." And it ran off. hynchatti thought she ought to go and tell the king what had happened, but she had no sooner got to the door than a strong gust of wind, left over from all the magic, picked her up and carried her right over to the other side of the castle. It was very damp and dark, and outside there was an awful snowstorm going on. As no one lived on this side of the castle, there was no furniture in any of the rooms, and the dust was inches thick. She made her way up to the top of the tower, where she noticed crowds of spiders stamping their feet and coughing and blowing their noses. "Excuse me," hynchatti began. "Go away," snuffled the spiders, "and bide your old business." "I was only going to ask," hynchatti began again. "We're not interested," sniffled the spiders. And they all started to cough so loudly, hynchatti thought she would go deaf. After a while, she climbed through their webs and got onto the windowsill. She'd never seen this side of the castle before. Far down, she could see the snow floating on top of a flood that had happened earlier in the morning. "I wonder," said hynchatti, leaning over the edge, and fell right out the window. Luckily, her fur blew out in the wind like wings, and she landed quite gently on a hill of snow. "Brr!" said hynchatti. "I don't like this at all." As she couldn't get back to the castle, she started to go in the opposite direction. She slid along for hours, and it got colder and colder, and more unhappy with every minute. Her fur was wet and draggled and clung to her, and the snow fell on her whiskers and froze them so they stuck out as stiffly as icicles. Just as she was giving up hope completely, the snow stopped and a violent thunderstorm began instead. In a flash of lightning, she saw a huge black castle standing in the middle of a frozen lake. When she got to the castle door, she found a big hole in the wall and climbed through. Inside it was dull and gloomy, and just as cold as outside. She was in a long hall with a high ceiling, and at the other end of it was a young man with a sad, angry face. He was dressed in black, and was pacing up and down between rows of tall jars. "Not enough!" shouted the young man suddenly. "Let's have some rain." And and he put his hand into one of the jars and pulled out a huge dripping rain cloud. "That should do it," he roared, and he flung it out the window, and sure enough, there was an immediate downpour. "Why," said hynchatti indignantly, "he's the one who's been causing all that bad weather on the other side of our castle." And when she went closer, she saw that all the jars had labels. Some of them were full of snow, some of thunderbolts, and some of earthquakes and floods. "Let's have some hail," cried the young man, dipping into another jar. "Wait!" shouted hynchatti by his foot. The young man halted and looked puzzled. "Who's that?" he asked. "I am the Princess Hynchatti," shouted the princess. Even more bewildered, the young man bent down and picked her up. "But you're beautiful," he exclaimed. "A snake with fur and whiskers!" And his dark face lit up, and he began to laugh. "How dare you?" hynchatti said crossly. "I'm very sorry," apologized the young man, still laughing. "Let me explain. You see, I am the prince of this kingdom, and ever since I began to rule, I've been so lonely that I forgot how to be happy. I haven't had a laugh in years." He waved his hand toward the jars, full of storms and earthquakes. "That's why I've made the weather so bad, because I've felt so bad myself. Now you've made me remember what it's like to laugh, and if you give me your solemn word to stay with me, I'll never let it snow or rain again, except when other people want it to." "Well," said hynchatti, who had begun to think that he really was a very handsome prince when he smiled, "I should like that very much, except that I'm not really a furry snake. I am a princess, and amazingly silly. That's why I look like this now, because I got a spell wrong when I was practicing magic." "Well, don't worry about that," said the prince. "I'll think of something. But first, let me make you some nice weather." And he took a big key from a hook on a wall and unlocked a wooden cupboard. Inside was a simply enormous jar, painted red and labeled Summer. He carried it to the window and took off the lid. In a minute, the thunder and rain stopped, and beautiful bright sunlight beamed out of a clear blue sky. "There," said the prince. "How's that?" There was a strange whizzing noise, and a moment later Girdle the witch flew through the window on her broomstick. "Hello, hello," cried Girdle. "Just thought I'd drop in for a chat, young man. My, hasn't the weather improved in these parts? I've never seen your castle at all, if the sun hadn't come out when it did. But I've been to visit my sister, you know. She wasn't too well, but I gave her a toad poultice, and it's done wonders." "This is Girdle, my magic teacher," said hynchatti politely. "Girdle, it's me." "Dear, dear. Is it?" asked Girdle. "Yes, I can see it is. I'm afraid you've not been doing too well with the spells." "No," said hynchatti, blushing to the tips of her fur. "Not to worry," Girdle said cheerfully. "If the young man will put you down, I'll fix everything." The prince put hynchatti on the floor. Girdle snapped her fingers, and hey, presto, there was hynchatti in her proper shape. "Why," said the prince, "you are a princess. In that case, I should be very pleased if you would marry me." "Certainly," said hynchatti happily. "But first we must ask my father." "Hop on Clob," said Girdle, "and we'll all go back together." Of course the king had no objections at all. "I'd be delighted, and I'm sure you'll both be very happy," he said. "But I must warn you that hynchatti is a little silly at times," he added to a water jug. "I don't mind that at all," said the prince. "The sillier she is, the more I shall laugh. And the more I laugh, the better the weather will be." So the prince and hynchatti were married, and it was always summer on both sides of the castle, except at Christmas. In fact, it was so lovely that all the spiders laying along the window sills in the sun, they got rid of their colds and coughs, but most of them went down with sunstroke. The